Welcome to a short brief on what we call the Double Sunrise Order, which is a short story about Qantas in World War II, who provided a vital link between Australia and the UK after the fall of Singapore. To understand how important the flight path between Britain and Australia was to the World War effort, first of all, let's look at the Battle of the Atlantic, because there was an area called the Black Hole, which was effectively where U-boats could operate without fear of aircraft attacking them. This was true through much of 1942 and well into 1943. Eventually this hole was filled by the use of aircraft such as the Catalina, long-range flying boat with a capability to attack U-boats on the surface. The Liberator, flying for Coastal Command, a bomber used in over France, but also used in long-range reconnaissance and sea protection, and eventually small escort carriers that went through that area and basically denied the area to U-boats, and that eventually broke the U-boat menace. But that was all happening in 1942-43. The story of the flights from Australia to UK had an earlier beginning. In 1941, early 1941, the Americans were ferrying the Catalina aircraft to Hawaii. They would not fly them to Australia because of their neutrality. However, the Australians were free to pick the vehicles up in Hawaii and transport themselves. So the RAF, or in some cases Qantas, would provide ferrying crews to pick up the Catalinas and fly them initially to Canton Island and then eventually to Sydney via Noumea. The aircraft had a range of 2,300 miles. However, two captains, Captain Tapp and Captain Taylor, worked out on the run from Hawaii to Canton that the fuel consumption was very accurate and they could push it a little further. They had found by reducing the engine RPM to about 115 knots, they could extend the range. So from Canton Island, instead of flying Canton Island to Noumea, they flew towards Noumea, monitoring the flight, the gauges, and then when they got to Noumea or close to Noumea, they decided they had enough fuel and they would fly on to Brisbane. And eventually, when they got close to Brisbane, they realised they still had enough fuel and they flew on to Sydney. They arrived with 84 gallons remaining in their tanks. But what it had done is prove that the aircraft had an actual range of well over 3,000 miles. It really set the scene for what was to become known as the Indian Ocean route. Prior to the war, Qantas in 1934 had joined the British Empire Air Route, England to Australia Empire Air Route. Qantas would service Sydney and sometimes from Auckland, but mostly from Sydney to Singapore, where BOAC crews from the British Overseas Air Corporation would take over and fly the rest of the mission through Karachi, Cairo, Alexandria, and eventually through to London. With the fall of Singapore, clearly that route was going to become untenable. But even prior to that, when the fall of most of Europe, a further leg had to be developed, which took them along the North African coast, Gibraltar, out to sea, and then back towards London. However, the main thing from Australia's point of view was when Singapore fell, this entire route became unusable because nearly all of this area here was now in Japanese control. When Japan invaded Singapore, clearly that severed the route that was being used with all of the fuel stops in the way between Darwin and Singapore. All that area was now under Japanese control. So, Captain Crowther of Qantas proposed a radical new idea, building on the experience of his own experience plus that of Captain Tapp and Captain Taylor, who had flown the Catalina over 3,000 miles without refueling. He proposed that it was possible to fly from Perth direct to Ceylon across the Indian Ocean without stopping, and return on a similar route. That was radical because the aircraft simply were not believed to have the range. However, after several trying attempts, trials, etc., by both Royal Air Force and by Qantas people, it was eventually proved it was a viable option, and 5 Catalinas were supplied to Australia for that purpose. These 5 flying boats were not just normal flying boats. They were taken from the Royal Air Force, stripped of all armament, stripped of their landing gear, fitted with extra fuel tanks, and to maximise their range, and nearly everything that was non-essential was stripped out of the aircraft. They then flew the mission from Perth on the Swan River to a lake in Ceylon called Koggala Lake, and because of its sheltered waters. These aircraft were going to be 4 ton overweight on takeoff, and therefore it was absolutely vital to have smooth, calm water. The base in Sri Lanka was also a base for the RAF's Catalinas and Sunderlands, and therefore could be used for maintenance of these aircraft. The route direct from Perth to Ceylon required them to fly through Japanese airspace, and in which case they could not use their radios. Everything had to be a highly secret operation. In fact, nobody was told, even our American allies, that these aircraft were doing the job. Nobody much thought they could do it because their own aircraft, the similar type of Catalina, was unable to do that range at all. However, Qantas had become particularly skilled at astronavigation, at long distance flying, reducing fuel consumption to the absolute minimum, and they'd also become very good at long hours of operation. The average flight was over 28 hours, and sometimes going to 32. The aircraft would be flown at 110 knots and then throttled back as the fuel was burnt, so that less and less fuel was burnt the longer the aircraft was in the air. And eventually, in the last part of the flight, it would creep up to 115 knots. What this did was keep the aircraft in the air for well over 24 hours. And so those taking off early in the morning or before dawn would see sunrise shortly after takeoff. And later on that night, as they were approaching Perth, they would be also subject to an early morning sunrise just prior to landing in Perth. And hence they came the secret order of the double sunrise. The reason for the secret was this was something nobody was to be told, for each one of these aircraft was totally unarmed and running without radio silence and totally dependent on good weather and not running into the Japanese. Each passenger was given one of these certificates on arriving in Perth. Now, the interesting thing about that was how many passengers would this aircraft take? The answer was actually 3. Had a crew of 5 and could carry 3 passengers and up to 450 kilograms of cargo all up. And as I said, they cruised at 115 knots to maximise their range. They were spent, although this picture shows them in Qantas colours, that is a stylised part of the process. In fact, they flew in camouflage gear, a camouflage pattern very similar to that of the RAF at the time. The 5 aircraft were named after the stars they used to navigate, and that was another part of why the night flight was the majority of the flight. You could have far better navigation at night as opposed to during the day when you only had the sun to use as your sighting angle. So the aircraft, and here's a picture of the aircraft, the Altair Star. As you can see, she's in mottled green cover for those looking down on the sea, and underneath she would have been a whitish colour, trying to blend in with the sky. The Catalinas flew for most of 18 months and did a number of flights. Then, as more aircraft were released, Qantas obtained initially 2 and then eventually 4 Liberator bombers that were converted into passenger aircraft. The Liberator was a 4-engine bomber with long range and was able to take off from land, which severely improved the comfort of the passengers. They were capable of flying over 3,000 miles themselves, and the flight took them from Perth to Learmonth, which is just outside Exmouth, and then for 16 hours they flew to Colombo. The flight time all up was around about 17, 18 hours over the sea and about 4 hours over land. They were much more comfortable. They had a much bigger capacity for passengers, also room for a galley and other luxuries such as people could eat. The previous Catalinas had been so subject to things like a hot plate for boiling water, and that was about it, and some sort of warm meal on takeoff, but it wouldn't last that long. In the Liberators, they were able to start feeding people more regularly and with hotter food. She could also carry a lot more mail. Prior to the Liberator, airmail had been uniquely transported slightly differently to what we think of. If you wrote a letter in 1943 to send to England, it would have been scanned, microfished, put on a microfilm, so 4,000 or 5,000 letters at a time put on a small roll of film, and then the film was transported to England. In England, they printed out your letter and sent it to the recipient. On the return, exactly the same thing happened. So that was quite a long process, and clearly you didn't get your real letter. You got a facsimile of it. However, once the Liberator was available, airmail could go back to paper, and the more familiar light papered aerograms became the method of transporting airmail. As the war closed in Europe, the Avro Lancastrian was released to Qantas. The Lancastrian was a derivative of the Lancaster bomber. It carried the same 4 Merlin engines that powered that rather famous bomber, but they removed all of the guns, obviously, put some windows in it, and also provided a much more streamlined aircraft. It gave an operational speed of up to 260 knots, but became a long-range express air service. The first Lancastrians followed a similar route to the Liberators, flying out of Perth and then picking up into Learmonth and then across to Ceylon. Then, once the speed of the aircraft was understood and the range was understood better, it was transferred that aircraft would fly Sydney to Learmonth, Learmonth to Ceylon, and then Ceylon to Karachi in Pakistan, and then return much the same way. At one point, shortly after the end of the about May 1945, the Cocos Islands became available as a diversion airfield and greatly improved the safety of these aircraft. However, that said, the Avro Lancastrian was the only aircraft to be lost in the entire operation. There had been an attack by the Japanese on one aircraft, a Catalina that landed in Cocos Islands, but to no effect, and therefore there had been no losses. However, one Lancastrian flying out of Ceylon on her way to between Ceylon and Cocos Islands was lost without trace. To this day, no one knows why it disappeared. The most likely scenario is that it exploded. Now, there's two possibilities of why this is considered the most likely event. One, they carried high octane fuel, and the aircraft was known to develop fuel leaks inside the fuselage. That was one possibility. The other one was that she carried a chemical toilet, and it was realized after the event that the fluid used in the toilet was highly explosive, and therefore it's possible that a passenger deciding to break the rules and have a smoke in the aircraft's toilet may have had a very rude awakening, and unfortunately his 4 other passengers and the crew of 4 were lost, and to this day no one knows where exactly in the trip that happened. The passenger seating was becoming more comfortable, but was sideways because the aircraft was so narrow, and each one of these 9 seats could be converted to double bunks, and up to 6 people could sleep on the aircraft, but they were so susceptible to turbulence that when you were sleeping you were strapped in, so you wouldn't want to go to the toilet in a hurry. However, they were an improvement and they were considered for rapid transport. After the return of Singapore to the flight system, the Lancastrians switched from flying across the coast to the west and then out to Ceylon to flying from Sydney to Singapore and sometimes on to Karachi, and eventually by 1946 Qantas crews were flying the aircraft all the way to London. But that was more or less the end of the Indian Ocean route, which closed in 1946. Well, that's about the story of it. It's a fascinating story. There is a great book out on it called The Double Sunrise, if you want to know more about it. But the story of Qantas and its flights over the ocean, which were and still remain the longest ocean flights across without stop ever flown, certainly by a piston engine aircraft, and even today's jets fly far less over sea than those particular journeys. Interestingly, Qantas is introducing a new flight shortly called the Sunrise flight. It will fly from London to Sydney or Sydney to London and Sydney to New York in less than 22 hours in one hop. So Qantas is once again cutting new ground. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that short brief. Goodbye.